New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hello there, I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thoughts, Roots, and Branches. And today, we're going to be talking about a branch that most people don't know very much about, and that's called divine science. Last week, we talked about Melinda Kramer, the one who created divine science. And this week, we're going to talk about the Brooks sisters, the women who built divine science into a worldwide presence and helped to keep it going for decades until other people took it over. So if we look at our chart on the next slide, we can see that down there in the corner of that little blue square, we're well into the evolution of the New Thought ideas from the earliest ancient philosophers and teachers through the Christians, through the Enlightenment, into the New Thought movement. And if we look at the next chart with the photographs of the more present and modern people, I put a little pink circle there around Nona. The Brooks sisters are well into the middle of the modern period, which isn't exactly accurate because we're talking about the 1880s to the 1940s. Who are the Brooks sisters? In the next slide, we get to see a photograph of each of them. Althea is the eldest, and she was the one who kept the other two interested in metaphysical teachings while they were all being good Presbyterians in Pueblo, Colorado. Fannie Brooks is the one who actually was the spearhead for the development of the school and was the one who kept things going quite well for a number of years. But the one everyone knows is the Reverend Dr. Nona Brooks, and that's who a lot of what we're going to be saying today is about. If we go on to the next slide, we're reminded that the divine science seal is telling us that it is everywhere. And the society, the agency, was created in 1888. It had been founded as an idea by Melinda Kramer in 1885, but was built by Nona and her sisters, who then went on to ordain both Emmett Fox and Ernest Holmes. So what was their life like? If we look at the next slide, we'll find out that they were born in Louisville, Kentucky. Althea was the eldest by several years, and Nona was the youngest by several years, born in 1861. Their father did quite well in the early years because he was a salt miner and he provided salt to the Yankees, and I'm guessing just a few of those folks south of the Mason-Dixon since they were in Kentucky. After the war, they moved up into West Virginia, and in Charleston, Nona graduated from what is called the Charleston Female Academy, which would have been for girls up to 15, 16 years old to make sure they had their reading, writing, arithmetic, some language, biblical language, and the skills that a young lady would need because, well, their father was pretty well off at that point. After about 10 years in West Virginia, the family moved to Pueblo, Colorado, and Dad shifted from the salt mining world to the metals world. much of the silver and iron and lead that was coming out of the mountains were going through Pueblo, Colorado. And in fact, by the middle of the 19th century, Pueblo was called the Pittsburgh of the West because of how much production of that type was going on. While they were there in the 1880s, they met Charles Myrtle Fillmore and their kids. And in fact, they were so close as multiple families that Althea ended up marrying Charles's business partner, Charles Small. So Althea becomes Althea Brooks Small. She had kids by the time that Nona was 19. So that gives you a sense of the difference in their age. They were very much involved in exploring possibilities together, but they were very active, as I said, in the Presbyterian Church. In 1890, the Fillmores had left the area, as you may recall, and their father died. Now, Nona was still a teenager at this point, and it was a difficult time because she had begun to be quite ill. She was having some problem with the throat that she called later an infection, but some reports say was probably cancer. So if we look at the next slide, we find that there was a diagnosis of some incurable disease. She'd been through all kinds of treatments. How many times do we hear this story in association with the founding of New Thought? And the doctors gave up on her. But in 1887, one of the neighbors, a woman who is actually quite well known in the history of Pueblo, Colorado, a woman named Kate Bingham, had received a similar diagnosis for a woman's problem. And she'd got on a train to Chicago and had been referred to Emma Curtis Hopkins, where she spent several weeks, went through the 12 lessons, and came back totally cured. And part of what she was told and took up, the word was, if you want to maintain this, you need to teach it. So Kate contacted all the women that she knew in the town of Pueblo, especially those poor Brooks sisters, and made sure that they were invited to her first teaching of the first class in Pueblo. Althea was delighted. Here was an opportunity for the girls to actually get teachings from Emma Curtis Hopkins, whom she had learned through Charles Small from the Fillmores, was very important stuff. So she made it a point to make sure that Fannie and Nona showed up for those lessons. Althea had children and she wasn't able to take that time at that point in her life. So Kate Bingham returns. She starts teaching Emma, and it's an amazing, amazing experience. In the next page, in the next slide, we get to see that the way that Kate was teaching it was exactly the way those early class lessons that Emma Hopkins had printed were put out there. And that third lesson is affirmations. The first is the foundation. What is the nature of the divine? What is our relationship with the divine? And all power is all good. Good is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, right? And in the second lesson that these girls learned, it was how to begin to negate the power of anything else, right? So one of the things Emma teaches and that Kate taught very clearly was fill your mind with these ideas. Fill your mind over and over and over again. Right? Let there be no other thought in your mind. So I imagine the girls as they're feeding the chickens, making the beds, cooking meals, whatever it is they're doing, working in the garden, walking to and fro, watching them and listening to them, saying these words over and over again. My good is my health. My health is God. God is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. My good is my strength. Just saying those things over and over again. And then when they get into lesson 2, saying there is no power of evil. Sin has no power. There is no reality to matter except as spirit, and so on. Adding that into my good is my God over and over and over again for the week. Well, they come into the third lesson. The way the third lesson is structured, it's taking those initial concepts from lesson 1 and making specific affirmations about them. And on the third lesson, something amazing happened for Nona. Now, this wasn't the first time she'd experienced something like this. There was a point when they were moving from Kentucky to West Virginia where Nona was feeling unhappy about leaving the space in Kentucky because it was a beautiful, beautiful space. And she was in the yard. She was 10 years old. And she was thinking how sad it would be to leave it, but how much she loved it. And as she was sitting in how much she loved it, she felt the whole yard, that everything around her, become filled with light. And she felt loved and cared for. And she doesn't know how long that lasted. But that experience when she was 10 was something that led to the experience now when she's 18 or 19, sitting in this third lesson in this classroom with Mrs. Bingham and these other students, these other women from the town. She's hearing Mrs. Bingham say, and now the affirmations. And one of the early affirmations, I think it's the third one that Emma produces, is, I live and move and have my being in God, the omnipotent good. And as Mrs. Bingham read that affirmation, the room turned into light. Nona experienced that same light in the room that she had experienced as a child in the garden. However, this time there was a voice. And the voice is, what is it that you will? Not want, not need, but what do you will? I think that's pretty important. And she said, I will to be healed. Now, we need to understand that a problem in her throat was keeping her from being able to swallow. So she was slowly starving to death. There wasn't much of Nona at that point in her life. I will to be healed. And she felt the light flooding her, the love flooding her. She felt it was done. And then the room returned to normal, and it was the end of class. And she comes up to her sister, Fannie, and she says, I'm healed, I'm healed. And Fannie says, good girl. And they get in the wagon, but really, I'm healed. And Fannie says, keep doing those affirmations. It wasn't until they were sitting at table that night and Nona ate a full meal with no problems at all that Fannie realized what was going on. Nona had found that place of being where that power is who we are. So in the next few years, things shifted and changed. Fannie and Nona stayed in their father's home after their father died in 1890, but they were pretty poor. Nona decided she better start earning a living, so she immediately enrolled in the local normal school. And then somehow through the work of Charles Small, who had been Fillmore's developer partner, and whatever else had happened, they were able to pay for her to go to Wellesley College for a year. And she got the degree and came back as a teacher. Fannie, in the meantime, was being courted by a number of possible suitors. Althea was at home raising the children and studying and encouraging all the esoteric metaphysical reading and experiences they could. I'm guessing she probably hung out with Kate Bingham a little bit. So Nona came back from her college year and became a teacher. But in the middle of all of that, I got my slides out of order here. I'm apologetic here. That's what was going on in the background. And as we become into the fourth lesson, this is 1 week after her healing, Fannie and Nona are heading home. And they stop by, as they often did, at their sister's home. Althea's small with her kids. And it turned out that Althea's daughter had been injured, and she was a hemophiliac. She was a bleeder. And everyone went into a panic except Fannie. Fannie said, got this handled. And she sat down with Nona and she said, okay, Nona, you are healing our niece. and I will treat for you. Now, this is a pattern worth paying attention to. This is not something that we see very often, but much more often early on in this process, where someone is holding the space for someone who is doing the treatment. Well, they did. And Nona entered into that light again. What is it that you will? I will that she be healed. And she was, and never had a bleeding problem again. And then the word got out. So about this time, the Presbyterian elders said, Fannie and Nona, what you are doing cannot possibly be a good thing. So they kicked them out of Sunday school. They could no longer teach in the Sunday school. Nona was able to teach in the regular school, thank heavens, because that's how they were supporting themselves. So Nona was working as a teacher, and Fannie was accepting. She finally accepted the courtship of Mr. Evans and became Fannie Brooks Evans and began to move to Denver. Oh my goodness. So in the next slide, being the healer, we see that Nona stayed in Pueblo, teaching in the schools. We see that Althea stayed in Pueblo with her husband, supporting Nona's healing work. So she would help make sure that after school and on weekends, people who wanted to be healed got to experience Nona. And I'm guessing Althea probably treated for Nona, but I don't have any record of that. Fannie moved to Denver with her husband, and then after a year or so, invited Nona to come up and spend her summers. So when she wasn't teaching school, she would move to Denver, spend the summers working with Fannie on healing people. They were given the basement room of another building, which had a dirty old couch on it and another chair, and people would sit there and wait, and then Nona would meet with them, and she would treat them, and she would do 10, 20, 30 people a day during the summers, having them come in, experience her entering the light, experiencing the change in their body and their emotions and their whole being, and then go home feeling well. Every now and then, she would be called to sit at someone's bedside during this period. And she would sit there and she would close her eyes to shut out the image of the person not being well. And the way she describes it is she would name all of the qualities of God, fill her mind with all of these qualities, beauty and joy and peace and power and all this marvelous nature of the divine, and fill her mind with it until she was in the light and she felt that presence asking her what she willed. She willed that this person be well, get up and live a healthy life, or words to that effect. And when she felt that that had been accomplished, she would go into the silence quietly and be grateful. And the person would usually wake up and nod and get up and get ready to live their life. It was amazing. So in 1896, Fannie persuaded Nona to move full-time to Denver, that she was clearly going to be able to support herself with her healing practice. And it was very soon thereafter that the three of them, Althea and Fannie and Nona, met with Melinda Kramer. The next slide shows us what happened as a result. When they met with Melinda Kramer, the thinking was, here was someone who not only understood the nature of the divine and could explain what Nona was experiencing and what all of them had experienced to some extent, but was aware that this was an exploration. This wasn't a set of doctrines, and they really liked that. So with her permission, they established the Divine Science College that first year. And Althea, the most mature of them, moved to Denver and became its president. Then Nona was the teacher. She was the one with the degree, so she had to be the teacher. She was the number one faculty, effectively dean of the college. Well, within a year, their students were coming back to them, and this has happened over and over again in the New Thought movement. People set up a school, they start teaching the principles, people start experiencing the power, And they go, oh no, I can't go back to regular church. We need a church. We need this to be meeting on Sunday mornings. So, as has happened with every other New Thought teacher on the planet that we know of, except Warren Feld Evans, Nona and her sisters created a church. Excuse me. With that one. So, what I think is interesting is not only did they think Nona should be the faculty for the college, and she did teach a number of other people to be faculty, and it worked out, but they decided she was the minister, again, because she had the degrees. So she became the Reverend Nona Brooks, ordained by, Melinda Kramer. So Melinda Kramer makes her the minister of the new Divine Science Church in Denver, Colorado. And she becomes quite active in the community as the minister. She's on the local school board. Well, she's a teacher, right? She gets on the prison board. That fascinates me, how this youngish woman at the beginning was, the only woman on the board, and this minister from a church that wasn't exactly recognized was considered appropriate for the prison board. And she was on it for years. And what people discovered was that the ideas that she brought and the words that she brought and the presence that she was meant that they had fewer prisoners who were in the system shorter time at less cost than at any other time. So they kept her on the board as long as she was willing. And she she was managing the teaching aspect of the school and managing the church. And we get an image of all of this in the next slide. This is not a little tiny church. It is now called the Althea Center. Isn't that a beautiful building? I'm blown away by what they were able to create. These three sisters knowing truth and sharing truth, not ever asking for money, but knowing they were fully supplied. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And there is our Miss Brooks as Reverend Dr. Brooks, because later she was given that Doctor of Divinity degree. And she was the primary speaker on Sundays. This took a lot of energy, but she was willing to do it in the name of maintaining the divine science, but also in the name of developing her own scientific or spiritually scientific approaches. So the next slide, we see kind of how this emerged. They formed the church in 1899, the college, and then Althea passed in 1906, which is interesting. That's the year Melinda Kramer passed. So both of Nona's elders in the movement, Althea and Melinda, have passed at this point. This is also the year that Emma Curtis Hopkins stopped teaching officially. She only did 101s and the occasional lecture after 1906. So this was a significant year in the Brooks' lives, and in Nona Brooks in particular. We come up over the next few years, and Fannie, who had been running the school after Althea was gone, passed over. So now Nona is the church and the school. She has trained many people. Fannie has trained many people. There are lots of people in the system, and they always turn to her for how do we get through this? She is the support person as far as they're concerned. Well, just before World War I came to happen, some of the people that showed up were offering their services. And one of the things about being in a church, as opposed to being in a business, is you don't get to screen who shows up. You take who comes. And a guy showed up during this time prior to World War I who seemed to be absolutely fabulous. He was charming. He had the right language. He was willing to take on all kinds of interesting things that needed to be done. But it turned out he wasn't exactly honest. And things started turning up missing or inappropriately handled. And this was very hard for Nona. She'd never had this kind of experience in her life. Fannie and Althea had been handling so much of the administrative details that she began to realize that she was, she had to do something here. So initially, she did what she always did. She treated. And what she got was, in some ways, a null response. There was almost nothing there. But in another way, it was clear guidance that she needed to deal with this at the human level rather than at the spiritual level. So she finally sat down with the guy and she said, I have to let you go. I understand that you have issues here, and they're not issues we can have in our organization. It was very hard. She really, really, really didn't want to do that. And it was totally unlike any previous experience she had. Well, a couple of years later, rumor came back that this fellow had gone into the military, had volunteered into the military, and had been given a position in the supply corps. Oh boy, now she really had to wrestle with things, because this was a perfect opportunity for someone with the kinds of things he'd shown up doing in the church to do even worse. And finally, after much consideration, and again, going in and being clearly left to do this in human ways, she wrote a letter to the commandant of the group that this man was in and said, I just need for you to know that this is what happened when he worked with us. That's all she did. And she got a very, very profuse thank you letter from the military for saving them quite a few difficulties, shall we say. All right. That was very hard. That period immediately prior to World War I and during World War I were difficult years for her. But she continued to use her standard approach. So in the next slide, what we see is from the time of that moment in the classroom, in the third lesson with Kate Bingham, Nona would take every situation that was presented to her and do a treatment. Every individual that came her way, in the church, they'd come and say, we're running short of supplies, or they're running short of money, or we need a volunteer to show up for this. Or as I said, in the prison board or the other boards that she was on, she would simply go in, she would do the treatment for that thing. Finally, after years, it occurred to her, if I can bring forth the supply for the moment, I can bring forth the eternal supply. I can bring forth, I can allow the divinity to work through me to bring this into being. So finally, she just treated for the well-being of the church. She just treated for the well-being of the school with much more detail than I've just said it. Boy, that took some of the pressure off. Not so many demands, not so many needs coming at her all the time. So that freed up some energy. And in the next slide, we see what she did over the next 20 years. First of all, at the end of the war, she attended that first International New Thought Alliance meeting where Holmes and Hopkins and others were present. And when we talk about Ernest Holmes, I'll talk more about his experience when he met Nona. And this was the meeting where Emma Curtis Hopkins was the official president and where the book High Mysticism was made available. So finally, Nona gets to meet the teacher of her teachers, and the two of them related very well, although there was never any further interaction that we have a record of. Over the next few years, then, what Nona did is cause the Divine Science Federation and the International New Thought Alliance to be merged effectively. They were still separate organizations, but they were jointly members, if you will. Then 10 years later, Nona said, I got to take a break. and she tried to resign from the presidency. They wouldn't let her, but they did give her an extended leave of absence. We know that she moved to Australia during that time, but she was also granted the grand tour of Europe during that time. And that's beautiful. Her experiences really opened her up to new possibilities. She came back to the States and went to Chicago, of all places, and she built a Divine Science church there and didn't run it. She participated in it, and she went up to the spiritualist and other esoteric movement camps in Wisconsin during that period of the mid-30s. And finally, in 38, the temporary position of others trying to cover for her was not working, and she succumbed, and she returned to take over the church in 1938. So busy from 1861 to 1938, from 87 when she first runs into Kate Bingham to 1937. That's a 50-year career, right? And then in 38, she comes back and does more. Amazing to me. As we look at what it was that was supporting her, though, we begin to understand that it was the teachings that helped her. So one of the books that she wrote, and I'll show you some more in a moment, is called In the Light of Healing. And in the Light of Healing, one of the chapters is Life, Light, and Power. The natural scientists tell us that when the amoeba moves from the shadow into the sunlight, it is because it craves the sunlight. First the desire, then the endeavor, and then the accomplishment. And again, they say that the water creatures did not first acquire lungs and then live on the land, but they tried to live on the land, and after repeated trials developed lungs and accomplished their great aspiration. So this is an example of how she was consistently and constantly bringing the ideas of science into her teachings. So if we look at this slide, the teachings, religion and science are one. For a person like myself who grew up planning to be a scientist, was a future scientist of America in high school, getting grants and so on all the way through, but had always felt this deep spiritual hunger and connection, finding someone who understood that was wonderful. So this is the teachings of the divine science. So closely linked are the spiritual and the metaphysical. So united are religion and science, that those who are drawn by the appeal of science eventually find themselves religious in the truest sense. And those of you who are familiar with the history of this may recall that Francis Bacon and then later the physicist Richard Feynman have both said, you give someone a taste of the sciences and they will give up all thoughts of God, but have them drain the cup to the full and they know that God is. And even Carl Jung, when he was asked in the late 50s on a Life magazine interview that you can get on YouTube if you want to listen to it, the interviewer says, and so do you believe in God still? Because of course they all did when he was growing up. And he looks at him, takes a deep breath, and he says, no, I know. This is not a blind belief. When we do this work, we come into that place, right? In the truest sense. And then she says, they say, all of divine science says, based on what Nona taught, those who think they want only the religious develop into scientific thinkers. Now, this is exemplified in the work of Emma Curtis Hopkins, to some extent Emily Cady, to some extent Charles Fillmore, all these people that we've been looking at, and Melinda Kramer. We develop the logical reasoning to support our understanding. And as we follow the logic of it, then our emotional and intellectual being come into alignment. And that's what happens when we follow what was known in this world as divine science. We look at some of their writings. We see in the next slide a couple of examples. We see in the next slide that Nona's books are available all in one volume if you want to get that. That's the Nona Brooks collection. And most of them are sermons that have been collected, much as most of the Charles Fillmore books are sermons that have been collected. This little journal over on the side, the pale thing there, was their monthly journal that went out for years and then has been replaced by a journal called Harmony, put out by the Divine Science Federation. And all of the movements, started with journals. They had their journal out within a year of establishing the school and the church. And this journal is always some combination of someone in the movement saying, these are our teachings, someone saying, this was my experience as I began to do this work, someone saying, this is what the work is, and then people listing their availability as teachers or as healers, or having books that are published, or they're going to be speaking somewhere. So that's what those journals were, and all of the different movements have them and had them from the beginning. The other book, the yellow and green book, is Fannie's version of divine science. We all know about Nona. Not all of us know that Fannie Brooks Small was pretty powerful in her own right. And she did some marvelous readings and writings. So you might want to take a look at those. My understanding is most of her writing came out of the journal. She was writing for the journal, and then those got turned into books. In the next slide, we'll get to see some more of these books. These are the one I was reading from, the Nona Brooks, In the Light of Healing. The other one is obviously a much more recent edition of one of her books called Mysteries. Again, these are her sermons compiled into books. Oh my goodness. So one of the things you might want to know is that the primary biography for Nona Brooks is Powerful is the Light. And this is the biography that was given to me when I was first trying to understand who this woman was and what they were doing. And in Powerful is the Light, we hear a lot of these stories. And then we also get a lot of details. For example, there's this wonderful story about on a streetcar. This is in Powerful is the Light. I've been healed. And where Nona is talking about her experience going home. They have been told to repeat phrases concerning health and healing. So Althea merely nodded at her sister brightly and said, yes, of course. And then added, we'll just about make it in time for our streetcar. But sister, Nona repeated, I've been healed. Yes, yes, of course, agreed Althea. Come, let's hurry. I mean, that's the kind of thing that was going on at that moment in their experience. Later in the book, we get all the world will be healed. And Althea treated her without result. Okay, so let me get where we are on all of this. Everybody in the world was going to be healed. That was the picture that possessed Nona those first few months after her own healing. People would treat, and one patient after another would arise and go forth healed. There would be no illness in all the world. God had not made illness, nor did he hold it in place. The fact was that it had no place, and in the course of a few years, 10 at most, illness would be gone from the face of the earth. Oh, the young. Nor did it occur to her that she herself, healed of her throat trouble, was not at the same time healed of every other possible illness. Yet all of her life, whenever she had been overheated, she had suffered. And one day at Glen Park, after she'd baked a cake and several other things, standing over a hot stove, suddenly she was ill again. Althea treated her without result. Then Fannie treated, repeatedly, without result. Now, Nona, it's your fault, they told her. You don't try to accept. But I do, she said crossly. Do you think I want to keep on feeling like this? Go on and treat some more. If you knew how I'd felt, you'd never stopped until you fixed it. So their mother said little, but she looked with amazement and extreme disfavor on this talk of treatments, this making of statements about God and health. She didn't understand it. She never would. She never wanted to. She only hoped they would stop before everyone would start thinking her family was queer. So what we're seeing there is that initial stage in everybody's process where we think we've got it, but whoops, we don't. We don't quite have it. And often the reason we don't have it is because we were surrounded by, enfolded in, embedded in a different set of ideas and possibilities. So at one point, Ben James, the husband of Fannie, said, if a customer complains, Ben never seems to think that the customer may have reason to complain, one of the guys pointed out. The customer may not be always right, but there must be some right on his side. All right. For a few years, this issue that Ben had of never understanding that the customer was right, even when he didn't seem like it should be. For a few years, he went into fire insurance, but at last he returned to the business he knew best, not as a rival, but as a manufacturer's agent. And everybody thought that he was causing a problem. So what Nona learned how to do was to treat. So this is the level of detail we get in this book, Powerful is the Light. To Nona, living with these families, the years seemed to rush past. Each day was filled to the brim with demands on her time and attention, interviews, treatments, lectures, lessons, committee meetings, calls, 1,000 details. For years, her greatest problem continued to be money. There were constant needs for the church, constant needs for herself, always she treated, and always the needs were met. But no sooner was one need cared for than another had risen, until sometimes it seemed to her that the more she treated, the faster the new needs came. Bingo. It was becoming a question of finding enough time in all 24 hours of the day to treat and do her other work. Finally, now I have no idea how this set of words is documented, but this is, quote, surely the laborer is worthy of his hire, Nona thought. I'm spending too much valuable time treating for such petty things. If I could only meet it at once and for all. And she determined secretly to do that. She set about it with a definite plan. Now, I told you she figured out that she could treat for the whole, not just for the individual things. She set about it with a definite plan. Each day she treated, as before, for whatever immediate needs there were. But also, no matter how many demands were made upon her, she took additional time to treat for permanent, all-time supply of everything. Once, standing at her window, looking out upon the treetop, she thought, why, life just doesn't say just so many leaves to the tree and so many leaves to this bush, or there won't be enough leaves to go around, right? Life abounds. It can have as much life as it has of life within itself. I am one with life. I too abound. I abound. I abound. She said in her treating mode, I live in a universe that abounds. It shares itself with me, for I am a child of God, his direct expression. And so as she began to work with this, she began to develop all through her life. We see her developing her ideas, understanding more and more fully what it is that we are and can be experiencing. We passed one slide, and that is that she actually did pass on in 1943. In her sleep, she never had problems with food again. And she never had problems with that illness that she had overcome briefly, not briefly, but completely. She never had any of those other illnesses that I referred to when she had been cooking in the kitchen. Her gravestone is there in Denver, in the primary cemetery there. And she continues to teach many, many, many people through all the people that she taught. And there we have the Brooks sisters, the primary builders of divine science. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you learned something wonderful. Have a good time.